Welcome back to Brains, Minds, and Consciousness. Today, consciousness. We made it. We've talked a lot about the mind, and even more about the brain, and we're getting to this point where we're understanding how some of our machinery work, how the literal bits and pieces of it work, but also how sort of the abstracted version works in a way. How we connect ideas, etc. So we've got some basic ideas, right? How we acquire associations, build internal models of the world. We're getting to the point where it makes sense why we would have this internal holding on of information. Information comes in, we hang on to it, we do things with it, we adjust our neurological weights to it. There's lots more here. I want to make that clear. Mind is not perfectly understood. There's plenty more questions that are currently ongoing, right? For example, other things that we might want to understand about the mind. What's its layout? What information moves where and when we do certain tasks? Another one is, what's the best way to model the way that minds work? Should neural networks be the primary way we do that, since they model neurons to an extent? Or are we better off thinking about things in terms of the abstract physical symbol systems? And also, what are all the different individual functions of the mind? Attention, perception, decision-making, motor action, all these very important things that we need to, the world of exploring the mind is still acting on. And a lot of primary cognitive science is in this realm. Though there's plenty of other work in the more direct perception action world that is just at the brain level, like how do circuits, make vision happen, that kind of stuff. Point being, we've only got so much time in the course, and we have to move on to the stickiest concept of the course, the grand finale of consciousness. So we need to get into this. And first, it's important to sort of lay out, what are we talking about with consciousness? One nice one I've happened upon is, consciousness is everything that you experience. It's not just your functions, not just how your arms move and how your eyes detect light, but what you are personally experiencing in real time, as well as reflecting on the past and predicting the future. But that's all still in that sort of present, right? We are extant. A conscious entity is current and now, right? Now, in the casual sense, we can think about unconsciousness, right? We typically think of that as sleep, right? When we sleep, there's plenty of activity going on. We're even dreaming, right? But we've lost a certain awareness of our surroundings. I would say this colloquial term isn't perfect. It's not a good anti-consciousness. It's not, you don't become a non-conscious being when you are, quote, unconscious. But this at least marks a starting point for understanding there is something a little je ne sais quoi about what it is to be conscious versus unconscious. Then there's the in-betweens of those times when you feel, am I dreaming? Sometimes we're kind of in the middle. We're a little bit aware of what's going on around us. We're a little bit not. If you've ever had a lucid dream, these are fascinating. Being aware that you are, in fact, at this very moment, dreaming. There's some cool effects there. In fact, you can look into it yourself, but I know what one is. You can actually practice certain skills in that scenario. So things that you kind of know how they work, like music. Musicians sometimes try to lucid dream to get a little more piano practice in. It's wild. But the point is that this illustrates an important distinction. There's two kinds of conscious, the way that we refer to them. Our everyday usage is sort of casual sleep usage. We go back and forth between being aware and unaware, but you can actually kind of be aware during your dreams. There's a much stronger question of consciousness at the heart of these philosophies and cognitive science questions. That is, how do we even have the capacity for consciousness, to be aware and experiencing things in the moment? So here are some questions that surround consciousness. What is the nature of this experience? Where is it rooted in our physical systems? What are the limits of its definition? How can we tell when something has the capacity for conscious experience? For example, think of a fella having to sweep up the shop at the end of the day, right? This is an experience. It is something that you do and you can remember. Some of you have had this job, right? I definitely have. You sweep it up, you kind of do your own thing. Maybe you're listening to music, who cares? You, the person, we would agree, undeniably had some kind of conscious experience. But the broom is moving too. Is the broom conscious? The broom is acting in the world, but really we all know, of course, you're driving all the action of the broom. You are the one that moves the broom and makes the broom do things. What about a Roomba, though? Roombas do things on their own. They don't need a person swifting them around. We have to guide them. We got to help them when they get stuck, that kind of stuff. But that's just because they're limited. Is the Roomba experiencing the room? It has sensors, just like we do, in a sense. It has the ability to do things with information, like decide, I should turn, right? It can find objects and sort of, some of them actually chase. They're like, oh, there's a spot. I think we would probably mostly all agree Roomba's probably not conscious. But we're seeing the edges of the question start to give a little bit, right? A broom is clearly not a conscious entity, at least by any measure that we could really come to. But a Roomba is pushing against that wall. What about an android? A fully androided creature, right? It is a full-on simulacrum of a human entity-ish, human intelligence given form in a body. If it was vacuuming your room, we might think differently, right? How different is this android's experience from the human dude sweeping the shop, right? It's still easier for us to pin things on this android and say, it's artificial. Somebody made that, it's all just wires. We made the wires, man. I don't know. But I feel like I've given you a lot of evidence that you're also just wires at the end of the day. Okay, but what about a cat? Is a cat vacuuming a carpet or a seat cushion? It's the same job. Would the cat really be having the same experience, though? I can assure you this photo was staged. Obviously, the cat's not actually vacuuming anything. But that's a difference of experience and a difference of complexity, maybe. The cat doesn't have any need for sweeping. What if it was sweeping? These are the questions of, this is sort of a gradient, and there's these strong questions. So the experience of sweeping the floor and cleaning up some dust is flexible. And this gets at the question of the nature of consciousness. There's this troubling thing, and we're going to hit a lot of those today. Welcome to why I care about this science, why I stayed in it for 20 plus years, right? Well, I'm not that old, come on, but a decade at least. So it's quite difficult to describe exactly what consciousness is. What's the difference between just doing that sweeping task and experiencing sweeping the task, right? Completing a task is something that we make computers do all day long, right? But we don't necessarily think of them as experiencing a task. The question comes down to, how can we quantify subjective experience? That's a really tricky one. Because think about all the things that you can observe in the world. This beautiful sunset. Think about all the things that are visible to you, like color stimuli. Think about all the things that are not visible, but come along with viewing an image like this. Your remembered experiences. Maybe you have an emotional response, an internal shift of all of your sort of, I remember a time that this made me feel wistful, or this was when that person broke up with me and made me really mad, whatever. We have these emotional changes too. You may also kind of feel relaxed looking at a sunset going down over the horizon. You may even engage in reflective processes where you examine your day or your week or the year you've had. Woof, we're all feeling that one. These are all things that you can do and that happen to you, but we've also talked about how they are all sort of mechanical. Maybe not all. We didn't really get into emotion and metacognition stuff, but the fact is that given that everything we've talked about happens in neurons, am I really conscious? Or am I just a bunch of neural clockwork? The difference is difficult. It's difficult to define it. So, this brings us to some of the historical work. For example, how can I be sure that I am conscious? Okay, so if I'm just a bunch of moving parts, fine. Neurons trigger other neurons in a giant complicated cascade, as we've discussed. Then why are we so sure that we're conscious at all? Is the Roomba conscious? Not sure. Would it even matter if it still behaved exclusively according to its programming day in and day out? So even if it thought it was conscious, like we might, are we just still moving in accordance with the neural patterns that are just baked right into us? How can we tell that we are conscious? Our old friend Descartes swoops in with a very important development on this topic, and I think it is a nice fixation point for the understanding of what it is to be alive. Descartes, man of many talents, most famously chased this line. So Descartes' meditations, these are the writings that he did to understand more about this kind of question. This is some of the work that you do in philosophy. You sit down, you think hard, you refute yourself, you chase down lines of logic, you defeat those with other logic. It's a really life of the mind kind of thing. But here's his deal. Here's Descartes' meditations kind of summed up for you. I know my senses can be deceived, or they can be faulty, right? They can be bad. My vision can fail. I can hear things that aren't really there. That sounds like something that, oh man, you must be really messed up if it... No, I mean, sometimes you just have a quick, wild auditory hallucination. Like you hear a snapping sound that doesn't exist. It just happens. Brains are weird. You can be startled by a dream too, right? Like something that didn't even affect your senses at all. You felt like you were falling, you shot awake, oh God. So that fact has plenty of evidence for it. My senses are not necessarily perfect. If that's true, how can I be sure that I exist in this world at all? Right? Maybe I'm just some kind of brain in a jar being shown pictures by some nefarious entity I'll never meet. Maybe every thought I've ever had is just more of these false pictures. He's tumbling, right? At this point in the meditations, he is kind of falling down a hole. It's this regression of, well, if my senses can't be trusted, and my memory can't be trusted, and everything that I think can't necessarily be trusted, beyond the shadow of a doubt, right? The question is, where does it stop? Is there ground to stand on, or does he fall down this hole forever? Do I have any proof whatsoever that I am real and not just the clockwork emitting a sort of an experience something? Enter the famous cogito ergo sum. There is one slender critical piece of evidence that I exist. I am asking myself this question. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Better phrased, more expounded upon. Something must exist to ask this question in the first place, and I am necessarily that something. I have to at least exist to ask the question. It's a small thing, but it's a good starting point to say, okay, look, I can freak out all I want about how deceitful I am and how mysterious everything is, and is life just a waking dream, and all these things, but ultimately, there's something there if it's asking. Now, this is the starting point. Now we have to address others. How can I be sure anyone else is conscious? I'm pretty sure I exist, but do you? What is this about? It's a little bit rude to suggest that y'all don't exist. So this is the concept of solipsism. Solipsism. I go back and forth on the pronunciation. I think I like solipsism because it's like solo. If the whole world could be made up, but I can really only be sure that I am conscious, well, then maybe everybody else in the entire world is just a figment of my imagination. True evidence that you exist is hard to come by. This is sort of an extension of that same Descartesian spiral that he did in his meditations. It's the idea that, okay, look, I found something to cling to. I know I exist. I need some proof that y'all exist too, and that's tricky. This brings us to the questions of privileged access. This is a philosophical term. The primary issue is at the heart of this solipsistic question is privileged access. This is the concept that you and only you have access to the contents of your own mind. Mind specifically. Doctors can look at your brain, right? Scientists can examine your neurons. But that's not, we've discussed, the mind is a more complex and abstract form. We don't have a way of directly measuring mind right now. And anybody who thinks a microchip could do so is a not nice word. So, but here's the idea. So you're the only one with access, right? You can explain it to others. You can say things about it, but you're the only one who can be sure of your mind's contents, because you're the only one who has the ability to reflect and introspect and examine things about the way that you work, even if that's just like figuring out, why did I phrase things that way, after the fact. But the trouble is that even that's not always accurate. Think about mental health issues or just like poorly understanding a concept. That can really cloud your own access to your own mind. Now, we can be pretty sure of our own minds. We at least have access to those. But the trick is that because we can't be sure, there is the possibility that everybody else is philosopher zombies, philosophical zombies. Different than the brain-eating kinds and the ones that want to chomp you. The zombie is the idea that maybe everything exists, right? But many, if not all people, are zombies. So people who just go through the motions but aren't, quote, switched on inside. So even if, like, two different people might have weird, different internal understandings of the concept of blue, and they can reflect on that, and they can discuss it, and they can have a conversation about it, there may be people who just are not lit up. Maybe everyone is just not lit up, and I'm the only conscious one. This is weird, right? So as I should have said more emphatically at the start, these concepts are slippery. and we're not going to just nail them all at once. I'm not historically a philosopher. That's really the area that we're in right now. But I've had plenty of interaction, and the ideas I'm posing here are things to really consider. So, this is the idea of solipsism. Now, there is something about solipsism that is, we've discussed this before. It's actually kind of a futile concept. And in fact, I'm going to tell you right now, get over it. You're not the only one, right? The real problem is that it's not useful to think that you're the only living, existing, thinking thing. Even assuming everyone and everything is a figment of your imagination, you still need to talk to people and board the subway and do everything that you got to do to get through your day, and they're still going to react to you in ways more or less like they're conscious. Weird. And it's violating one of our key principles of mind. So remember that we're trying to study how the chaos of the external world can be understood to our minds through forming associations and patterns that are consistent. Whether you exist or not is secondary to whether you consistently behave as if you do exist. So again, even if everybody else is a figment, they still behave as though they are people. So who cares if I am the only one? Also, an important thing of empathy, right? If you behave as if you're the only person, you're going to do a lot of things that maybe you shouldn't ought to be doing to other people around you. So when you indicate to other people that you have an internal experience, like sorrow, confusion, like a headache, then that's external evidence that we may share a similar internal life. It doesn't matter if it's true. I just need to be able to count on your behaviors, and honestly, it's pretty nice to connect to somebody about something as weird and private and internal as your own mind. When you express to someone, oof, I've got a hell of a headache today, and they say, oh yeah, I get those all the time, you now have this shared internal thing that you could question and say, whatever, zombie. Or you could say, oh dang, I feel that. It's important. Another thing that's more sort of mechanical to the way that we can do things in the world is this idea of theory of mind. It's one of those tools we have in our kit. We can predict what others might be thinking because, for example, we might know why someone else is angry. We might need to be able to figure out what somebody else is talking about. We might need to understand how they might succeed or fail at some task. And there's some evidence here, I would say, that the fact that we are primed to do this as individuals who are capable of like kind of reflecting on others' possible internal processes means it's a pretty long shot that we're alone in this. So, can you be sure? No. You can't be sure that everyone else truly exists. That's a little unnerving. But it's just more useful to behave in accordance with the evidence, right? If I can't be sure a tree exists, I still need to recognize that I can interact with that tree, right? So anyone who demonstrates the workings of their mind, we might as well give them the benefit of the doubt and let them do it. Let's just talk to them about things. Be nice. Okay. That's another topic, right? Now, we're going to shift sideways a bit into an interesting pool of the sort of what it is to be an entity, and that is identity. Okay, so I'm not you. Like, fine, I agree that you and I exist and we are distinct, and that's important. But there's also this strange thing of I'm not you. Maybe to a distant alien we might seem pretty alike, but I got different hair. I'm probably heavier than you. You know, there's differences between us. What distinguishes our identities? So, again, identity is associated with your uniqueness. We understand ourselves as different from others by understanding that we have a unique identity. I am separate. I am distinct. This concept comes up a lot in other places. Math, law, computer programming is huge. You know, every object you create has its own identity. It must, otherwise it would just blur together with the other data, and there would be no point in creating an object, right? In math, it's about, you know, a number times one is always the number. You know, little things, but still. The question, though, is for us, is what defines our identity? Our uniqueness. Let me talk about Theseus' ship. This is a combination historical fable and thought experiment for a philosophical set of questions. Think about this scenario. Theseus and his crew operated and maintained the bespoke Theseus' ship, right? Over time, every time they go out, they come home, the ship needs some repairs. They strip off some of the boards, and they'll update them with new boards, right? Who knows how many times? Over the years, go and go and go, and the ship keeps getting pieces replaced. But, as a cost-saving measure, some of the dock workers had systematically been saving the discarded boards. And gradually, they started to reconstruct the ship in its original condition. When Theseus discovers this, he shouts, "How dare you steal my ship?" When one of the workers replies, "Is this your ship?" And that's the question. Is it the same identity? Right? Theseus only cares about his ship that he's maintaining, but it's not... Let's walk through it. Ship of Theseus, it keeps piling boards and boards and boards over time. It stays updated with new things. Ship B. But also I can reconstruct the old parts into ship C. What is the ship's identity? Did Theseus's active ship inherit its identity over time, step by step, from each previous iteration? Or is the original configuration key to the ship's identity? The original boards, the original items that were on the ship? Here's the real tricky part. My friends, you are Theseus' ship. There's these different measures in biology of every 5-ish to 15-ish years, most of the cells in your body are replaced with fresh ones, including some neurons. They used to think that all neurons, you get them at 15 or whatever, and it's over, but not always the case. Some of your neurons are replaced and healed and changed. Did you notice that? Probably not, huh? Did it change your identity? On reflection, I suppose I could say that I'm a very different person than I was 10, 15 years ago. But, I don't know, I still have the same driver's license. But the question is, should we think about our identity in different terms? And the answer is not yet solved. Consider cyborgology, right? Let's keep extending this. Assume that technology reaches a point where we can safely and consistently replace damaged neurons with better chips, with electrical systems that behave identically to the original stuff, maybe even a little better. But they capture everything, even learning, even the errors that we should be making, right? Because we want to think in the patterns that we do. It requires a little bit of error making. What point on this slow trajectory do you cease to exist? Does your identity cease to be? Or is this is this constant iterative upgrading enough to keep you the conscious same entity, right? Is there one special piece that finally falls apart? Where? Some folks in the old days thought it was the pineal gland, that all soul and consciousness and everything was switched on right there. It's bunk, but they were trying, you know. Let's move into another topic that's related, the self. Very connected to identity, right? But the self is a little bit different. We have a concept of self in most every language, including all computer languages. Self dot whatever, this dot whatever. This concept maps pretty well to our concept of consciousness. If something exists to experience the world, then what is that thing, right? If for Descartes, the self begins with the fact that the self is capable of asking a question. So, this is a fundamental question. Self is where the world stops and I begin. This is sort of one way of framing this question. Or rather, this sort of a rough definition of self. But the question is, where does the world stop and where do I begin? Right? If the self is my body, what if I lose part of my body, cut my arm off? Am I less self? Or am I still the same? If it's in my brain, what if a tamping pole blasts out my frontal lobe? I'm still the person. I am a little different. I behave differently. How much of self has moved? Can my memory be faulty? And I still exist. My grandmother rather, had Alzheimer's. And some of you will know, sorry if this dredges up bad memories, but you know what that's like. It's very strange watching someone change like that. The question is, where is the line of self? Is it the homunculus, our old friend, that we and countless others have spent a lot of time trying to defeat in terms of concept? Where in the brain does the self live? Where's that little guy hiding? As I said before, the pineal gland was one of the points in history where, in the 17th century, they thought the pineal gland might be where the mind and body meet, right? The dualist says, there must be a connection point. It's not even remotely accurate. All it does is regulate certain hormones and doesn't really even have much to do with consciousness or awareness at all. Not sure where they got that. There was some sexist things about anatomical differences of the pineal gland. Look it up. It's a mess. People will do anything to justify their stupid claims. But here's the issue. There is this strange, infinite regression. There's the world, and then there's your body in the world. We all kind of agree that our mind is probably endemic to the body. But then your mind has other things in it, like memory, right? It has function, it has the ability to hang on to experiences that the body had in the world. Further on down into neurons and proteins, right? Where is it? Is there one atom that makes me? Or is it something more complex than that? I think you can rest assured that it's the latter, but still, the question is open. So these are the many concepts of consciousness that we've touched on. And some of them being sort of hard questions, right? What's the deal with conscious experience? Cogito ergo sum, solipsism, identity, self, further. Let's bring science in, because this is cognitive science, baby, and we are going to do our damnedest to figure some things out. So, this has been a lot of the philosophical quandaries of consciousness. The answers are not clear. Some of them are useful, and some of them are a little more kernels, like cogito ergo sum, we can hang on to that at least. But some of these other things don't have clear answers. And until we have sufficient evidence developed, right, much like we began to understand the brain once we got imaging techniques, the best answer to some of these questions is often a matter of your perspective, right? So how do you tackle these things more in the philosophical realm? But these questions do help inform scientific exploration. That is the beautiful relationship between philosophical exploration and scientific exploration, and I rarely see it so tightly bound as in cognitive science. So it's great. Let's talk about consciousness in the brain. You got all your moving parts, your goals, your abilities, your functions, neural populations, cognitive systems. It's difficult to point where consciousness specifically resides. But in 2016, there was some interesting work touching on this. Fisher et al. Investigated which brain regions and networks between brain regions might correlate with the status of being comatose. Comas are this state that is pretty well considered to be one where we are not consciously experiencing the world, or, for that matter, anything. There's not much in the way of dreams. Well, it depends on the state, right? But here's the deal. Examining which brain regions are consistently damaged in coma patients, we can find hints at what might cause this comatose state. So they examined brain activity in both coma and control patients, and what they found was a small network connecting the brainstem to two higher cortical regions that correlate with this comatose state. 11 out of 12 coma patients had damage here. That's a lot. Still a small n. So is it solved? No, of course not. But there's a lot more work that we can do from here, right? We know that the brain is complex, and this study is an initial exploration of some of the structures involved in this sort of experiential component of being a brain person, right? And then this other question is a coma actually non-conscious? Or is it just a very deep dream? Like, what is that? How does that relate? You know, there's questions that we need to answer there. But this is exciting. This is finding, again, as always, in science, you detect the edges of what might make us conscious or unconscious as a start. Here's some other work relating to the self. Whether or not there's a strong definition for where the self lives, you know, it's still this useful construct, right? That helps us reflect on the process of being a living, thinking thing, right? Psychology considers the self mostly in terms of the knowledge and behaviors we have about our own system, right? About our ability to reflect on ourself, having a self-concept of what we think of as us versus not. And there's some cool comparative research on self-concept using chimps and actually other animals. There's several animals that have this capacity. Mirror studies. So put a dot on an animal's face and show them the mirror. Like a red dot, a red dot of like crayon or something, removable. Animals that react to the dot show some measure of self-concept. They recognize that the thing in the mirror is not just another monkey, is not just some kind of strange object. They know that it's them. They're able to detect themselves. Primates, elephants, dolphins, and some birds have this capacity. They have self-concept. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have a strong definition of where to draw the line of selfness, but it's the beginning. It's evidence that self is something that we can at least detect, right? As an individual. We have a sort of a gut sense of what self is, and as do many animals. Here's another. Where do we draw this cognitive line, right? Related very much to where we draw the line of self. So we chase the homunculus, right? We try to figure out where the self lives, and we wind up with that infinite regression. Who's watching whom? One solution for cognitive researchers is that you can simply ask different questions depending on where you decide to draw the line. What should we consider to be cognition, for example? If we think about cognition as the primary action of minds and selves to boot, then I can draw different lines to say, well, I'm going to include this in the concept of the self and the mind, or rather in the cognitive, reach. We're going to talk two approaches: embodied cognition and extended cognition. Embodied cognition does away with this sort of magical distinction that the brain is necessarily where cognition lives. Sure, the brain is doing a ton of the work, but so does the nature of our bodies. For example, we can't really explain how we walk, right? I don't have access to understanding all of the mechanics involved in my body. But we do know how to exploit the dynamics of our physical bodies and physical systems to achieve the action of walking. I don't know it, but I sure as hell can do it. So it's fascinating because it's this space where you do away with the concept that your brain is unique, right? And instead you get into the idea that your brain is really mostly interesting because it can affect other things, like the things in our bodies. Now, you can run further with this into extended cognition. This is the idea that anything in the world that we can directly interact with is also part of our cognitive processing. For example, your phone stores all of the phone numbers for you now. This is a component of your extended memory. Now, usually you're just going to tell the phone to go ahead and click the number, but if you needed to find somebody's phone number to write down on a form or whatever, you go to your phone. We used to memorize this crap. It was a pain in the butt to memorize even just 7 digits for your local stuff. So that's one of the ideas. The phone is this extended memory for you. If someone snatched your phone while you were walking down the street, you would be in a pretty vulnerable place because holy crap, how many things are you relying on your phone for? And this isn't to judge you. I use my phone just as much as y'all do, I promise. But the fact is, it is a piece of our cognitive architecture under the idea of extended cognition. So another element of this is consider you and your car together are a much different entity than either of you are alone. You, without your car, you have certain capabilities, yes. Your car without you doesn't really have many capabilities at all. But you and your car together, your capabilities extend beyond normal walking behaviors into this interesting space of high-speed maneuvering on things like highways. Something that your brain would never have to build anything for without access to a car, and yet you start to build understanding. You start to understand how high-speed motion works. So these are different ways of drawing different lines to be able to ask different questions. You might ask different questions in an extended cognition viewpoint than you would in just a straight up classic, well, the mind is the brain and let's stick to that. So those are some things about consciousness in science, right? We see that we're only just toying with the edges of understanding what it is to be conscious. Some evidence points to neural structures that can play a significant role. That's really cool. We see animals exhibiting some self-concept. That's great too. But more broadly, ideas about how we define the self provide different frameworks for scientific investigation. So not only are we trying to, give back to the philosophical questions in the scientific explorations, as has always been the case, you find a new thing, you prove it, that's evidence for Descartes of the world to use in their arguments to themselves, right? But on the other token, these philosophies, these different, posing the idea that, there's infinite regression, there is no self apart from the way you define it, so science can come in and say, well, let's define it different ways and see what happens. An extended cognition researcher might ask very different things, as I just said. So that's science's take so far. We can also talk about consciousness in the world. So the hairiness of being conscious entities in a world surrounded by other conscious entities, doing things, it raises lots of questions. One big one that we love to harp on, but with good cause in some cases. Remember how we discussed part of our cognitive system's job, at least in the classical conditioning world, is to filter out which things are attributable as causative. The back end of that is the concept of blameworthiness. If we can investigate what may or may not have a sense of self, we can also ask questions about whether something is capable of accepting blame. Welcome to self-driving cars. In 2018, a car with an autonomous driving feature owned by Uber struck and killed a pedestrian walking her bike alongside the road. Setting aside whatever the possibilities are, whatever the pedestrian did, maybe she made an unexpected movement, or maybe whatever. Like, we're not here to blame the victim. She was killed by this car, right? Regardless of her actions, cars are still culpable, or at least the people driving them are. But who's to blame here? Considering some of these elements of the Uber crash, there was a driver, and they were demonstrably distracted by their cell phone. This is something that they copped to, right? But the car was supposed to be in this safe autonomous mode too, where it could do all of its detections and not screw them up. Uber was in charge of deploying the cars, and there were many teams of programmers likely involved in the development of the car's algorithms that made it make the decisions that it did, including the decision to not stop when the pedestrian was present. We've also got the United States government, who, in a sense, dropped the ball in not having any good regulations in place for deploying these vehicles. They're being cautious enough by only slowly rolling them out, but still, this is a pretty strong question and a pretty hard problem. And one of the places that this gets fuzzy and strange is, can we blame the car? The car does have a sophisticated system. It perceives the road and pedestrians, it computes various possible outcomes and actions it should take in various circumstances, and it takes those actions in accordance with its basic plans. But is it culpable? Is the car entity itself? Do we put it in jail? Do we recycle it? Is there any reason to think this car is distinct from all the other cars that are just like it? Should all cars of this model be smashed into cubes, in the junkyard? Or if we update its code, does that change it, right? This is an interesting world because it's sort of the Wild West for law. These questions show this real-world need to investigate more about consciousness and sense of self. At present, it's still pretty clear how various people factor into the culpability here. But what if these systems get more complex and more autonomous? How will we handle that near-human intelligence that makes a mistake like this? We're not there yet. And again, it's pretty easy to say that this car just needs to be reprogrammed and their systems need to be better and their sensors need to be replaced and all that stuff. I can't just get better eyes. The car can, right? It's tricky. It's an interesting beginning. Here's another hard one. Come along for the ride with me. Free will. Oof. So this is an important one for understanding cause, effect, and blame, is this question of free will. What am I able to engage in of my own volition, my own decisions, right? Do we actually have something resembling free will? Are we deliberate creatures, or are we just along for the ride? There's some arguments to be made here. So if we're made up of neurons, and those neurons make up our brains, and our brains dictate the operations of our minds, and all of these systems and subsystems behave in totally predictable ways, then how can I actually possess anything resembling free will? Where's the part where I am able to do something of my own volition? Or am I just machinery? This is that question I asked earlier. Something that helps to kind of really frame this argument is Laplace's demon. Demons, by the way, this is the concept. It's not necessarily a biblical demon or a satanic demon or whatever here. It's the idea that come up with a thing that is beyond us and is like built to a specific purpose and use it in a philosophical question, right? Laplace's demon. Imagine a demon that possesses two curious qualities. It knows the exact position and state of every atom in the entirety of the universe, and it knows every law of physics, chemistry, neurology, and etc. It knows the state of the universe, and it knows the transitions between states of the universe. Laplace's demon would then, in a sense, be able to both deduce every event that ever came before the present moment and predict every event that will ever happen hereafter. Every state is connected tightly to the other states, right? It knows that this photon irradiating from the sun is going to move at the speed of light X amount. It also knows that you are going to flinch when the word bang is shouted at you. This demon knows everything before it will happen, including every thought you've ever had. Okay. It's just an argument. It's just a sort of like I said, the thought experiment, right, to guide this question. But what Laplace's demon illustrates is the concept of determinism. Laplace's demon just is showing us that in this most extreme case, if you have a full understanding of all the mechanisms of nature and know all the rules and all the data, it means you can predict everything. But if we're fully predictable, how could we have that free will? If everything is just a cascade of things bumping into each other, what's the deal? Enter a bit of chaos theory. So Laplace's demon assumes that the current state of the universe is definable. Current thinking in chaos theory is that that's actually impossible. It's the veracity of our models are often extremely sensitive to arbitrary things about, like, how many decimal places are we rounding to, right? So the fact is that you can't necessarily capture the state of the universe in any meaningful way. It's too complex. It defies description. Now, that's cool. I think chaos theory, information theory. If you're into cognitive science, read the books The Information and Chaos. Get them both. But does this really suggest free will is just kind of hanging out somewhere in the chaos? Not clear. Free will is this. Really, what it comes down to is it's a useful construct, right? It doesn't really matter if I am built of certain things. I am still potentially a car that needs to make decisions about where to move on the road. Otherwise, I'll strike pedestrians, right? So it doesn't really matter if our world is hyper-deterministic or too chaotic. The idea that my decisions are real and they affect the world is a little bit more useful mindset than that paralysis of wondering if my actions are predetermined. Sure, maybe they are. But sitting here thinking about them as if they are predetermined is its own sort of bad state, and you can just say, never mind. I just did it. You can do it too. So how we define free will is this curious question, but really, we all make decisions based on our understanding of the world around us, whether that's free or not. And so at the level of description of the human mind and the self, we might as well behave as though free will is secured. And that brings us to how consciousness in the world has interacted. There's various fields of law that are soon going to have to reckon with the idea of these really important distinctions about automated, autonomous, and conscious, right? And then there's still some hairy questions about whether or not we possess free will. Are we just stuck on this deterministic tracks? And does that even matter, right? Bringing us back to the very big questions. Consciousness is not solved. It's possible it never will be. We are these wonderful mechanical meat machines that navigate the world. We love, we create things, we fight, we get tired. But why do we have a conscious experience when we could just easily be robotic machinery? Why do I get to have a conscious experience? Why am I alive and thinking and looking and seeing and experiencing and remembering? Does the concept of the soul fit in here? Look, we're talking science, right? This is not a religious studies course. But where science lacks evidence and explanation, there is room for debate. And we saw some philosophies about the distinction between the mental and the physical, right? Maybe there's some kind of complexity that we don't quite understand yet, where a non-physical entity, like a mind, connects to the physical world. And not through a pineal gland, but more through maybe this the idea of emergence. Emergent consciousness. It's a different take. It's the idea that perhaps our conscious lived experience is just a natural phenomenon, a natural consequence that emerges from being as complex as we are, and the way that we actually interact with the world. Sure, our receptors trigger, our neurons fire, our muscles flex, and our conscious experience just happens to fall out of that interaction. Your brain, body, and environment are going to interact no matter what, and the fact is that when you are doing that in a sufficiently complex way, hey baby, you get to be conscious. And that brings us to a close. We've explored many questions without clear answers. That's philosophy for you. And I think the strongest takeaway, I believe, is that you should not be afraid to routinely ask such questions. What's the nature of my lived experience in this very moment? How does my self-concept differ when I have a phone, or when I have transport, or when I have access to money and funds? The things within my reach change myself. How much of my internal thought is intentional or just a sort of automatic result of physics and chaos? I can let you know that it's a gradient. It's not always the same. Some things you do are quite intentional, and some things, at least by our definitions of intentional, and some things are totally reflexive. Is my experience the same as others? What might differ between us in terms of some of these other questions? And then who's to blame for my Roomba eating a Lego and catching on fire? It's probably me for leaving the Lego out, but that's still a question of what should I do in the future, right? Doesn't matter who's to blame, but we need to figure out how to fix it. And that's it. That's what I'm leaving you with. Apart from, of course, as always, the final thought. Being aware that you are a thinking entity, but also that there are rule-governed mechanisms for how you process and interact with the world, is a powerful gift. Don't hesitate to examine your own thought processes. Don't hesitate to question them. Don't hesitate to change. You exist. So do I. Go on.